I wanted to ask Sheila, you began your talk by mentioning a journalism idol of yours,
Yes.
Joe Schlesinger, the veteran foreign correspondent in the white trench coat. I wonder if you've ever reflected on, after following in his footsteps, how he might have dealt with the trauma that he experienced in his career.
Joe's story was very complicated. There probably are people in the room who knew Joe. Joe was a Holocaust survivor. He got out of Czechoslovakia on one of the kinder transports organized by Nicky Holt. He returned to Czechoslovakia after the end of the Second World War to discover that his entire family was dead, with the exception of a brother who had been with him in England. He ended up in a displaced persons camp, came to Canada, and launched a remarkable career. He covered Vietnam. He covered diplomatic high doings in diplomacy. Joe was a very well-defended personality, and I think, as I said, there is a larger group of people who may suffer trauma but don't ever develop PTSD. I think Joe was probably in that category.
I also wanted to ask, and I've heard journalists express a similar sentiment to something you said tonight. You said they suffered far more than any interloping journalist who signed up to be there. They being the folks that you were meeting in, I think at that time it was Sarajevo. But you also spoke about the stigma and the real or perceived fear that comes with disclosing to management that you're struggling with an assignment or have maybe even been diagnosed with a mental illness. So I want to ask you, what do you think keeps so many journalists silent? Is it that stigma, or is it the feeling that their trauma is somehow less than the trauma of the folks they witnessed, and therefore they almost feel like they don't deserve or aren't worthy for that support?
I think part of it is that this is a relatively new conversation that we're all having. Before Anthony Feinstein's work, there was no data. There was nothing. I mean, I think those of us who have been in the field can probably look back at colleagues who may have spent a little too much time in one war zone or another and were suffering because of it. Some people couldn't put a name on it. Some people didn't know how to seek help. I don't think it was because they felt unworthy. I think that this question around trauma is a question that is new, relatively new in terms of discussion. And again, newsroom culture plays a really big part in that.
You also spoke in colorful detail about some of the places you've been and the conflicts that you've covered, and I'd like to hear a bit more about some of the people that you met along the way. I think so often, and it could be instructive to some of the journalists in training here, what do you say to someone in that moment to try to gain their trust in order for them to share their story with you?
I mean, sometimes people are just absolutely astonished that you're there, that there's somebody who's come from, in the case of working as a foreign correspondent, there's somebody who's come from far away and is actually interested in what's happening to your life and what's happening to your community. In some cases, there's a difference between being in that kind of moment and then deliberately seeking out people to go on, say, a Jerry Springer type show, which is a whole other level of manipulation and dealing with people, and that's a whole somewhat separate but not unrelated topic, because it has to do with people who are suffering trauma themselves and how do you deal with those people. And that's a secondary part of the discussion that I don't think we've figured out very well at this point, how to deal with and how to work with people who are living through some of the worst trauma of their lives and try to put them in a position where you don't make it worse.
In that case, one of the things that I sometimes talk about or think about when I'm talking to students about trauma is, being willing to walk away. And so were there times in your career where you came across a person and you felt like you would do more damage to them if you told their story, so you decided to walk away from them and find a different way to tell that story?
At one point in the late 90s and early 2000s, I was doing a lot of work around war crimes, and especially around the use of rape in war, which automatically, if you're talking about rape, you're talking about trauma, you're talking about trauma survivors, and you're talking to people who have survived that. And it became clear that it was a very delicate balance. You had to be very, very circumspect and very careful and ask open-ended questions in such a way that if someone didn't want to go there, they didn't feel obliged to go there. You didn't put them in a corner where they felt trapped. And that's quite a delicate balance.
Were there times when you ever felt like you said the wrong thing, or did the wrong thing?
I'm sure I did. I'm sure I did say the wrong thing. I'm sure I did the wrong thing. I was probably fortunate enough to have really smart translators working with me who could sort of like just bury that under the carpet. But I can't think of any right now.
You know, many journalists in training and working journalists, myself included, would love an opportunity to be a foreign correspondent, or perhaps think we would love the opportunity. Maybe you've given us some food for thought. But many folks, those opportunities aren't as abundant as opportunities to work at a metro newspaper or radio organization across the country. And there are lots of domestic trauma stories that you could get involved in. Anything from covering a court trial that's quite gruesome, covering an accident or a natural disaster. If in the case of any Indigenous files, certainly covering residential school survivors and missing and murdered Indigenous women. So I guess if you know, knowing that that is the work that some people will go on to do, what specifically do you think journalism schools need to do to better prepare students who are entering the field?
I think that's a really interesting question, and I think that probably the single most important thing that schools could do, recognizing that there are many paths to journalism, is to make sure that their students know and are aware of what the symptoms and signs of trauma are, that they can recognize it in themselves and that they can recognize it in the people that they're reporting on, that they have something in their toolbox that will help them deal with people who are themselves dealing with trauma, and then recognize in themselves when they are suffering from trauma, and that they are suffering from, that there's some action that they need to take. I think just that knowledge would be extremely helpful. It doesn't have to be, I'm not going to advocate, for example, the journalism schools take on the very expensive business of running hostile environments course. That really does belong over in the purview of corporations and media organizations. But I think in terms of, just as a life skill, educating people as to what the signs and symptoms of trauma are, what you can do about it, would be really valuable. There's also a really interesting case in Australia, which is particularly interesting. It's a case that was decided in 2019. A reporter who had covered courts for many years, covered courts and crime for many years for The Age, which is a big Australian daily, sued her employer, basically alleging that her employer had created an unsafe work environment for her by failing to recognize the trauma that was being visited on her in covering some of these really gruesome cases and stories that she was following. And while the Australian courts had about a decade earlier rejected a similar kind of case, in this instance, they said the employer has enough information. There is enough information out there about the impact of these kinds of events on journalists that the employer should have taken steps in order to ensure that the workplace was safe for their reporter. And the reporter was awarded about 180,000 Australian dollars in damages. That's a world first, but that should be a signal to every employer that if you are complacent about your employees' mental health and the damage that they may suffer in doing the work that you, the employer, instruct them to do, that you may find yourselves before the courts.
Do you think that, you know, knowing what you know about the organizations that you worked for and others, do you think that organizations are taking that seriously? Do you feel like they're on notice? They should be on notice, but do you think they're actually taking that seriously?
Some organizations are much better than others. There are some organizations where there has been real leadership. The BBC is one. And although there still have been problems within the BBC, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation is another one. Canadian Broadcasting is another one. And there are organizations where there have been individuals in a very senior leadership role who have themselves taken this on and have believed in it, but in fact have not been able to communicate that through the DNA of the organization. And the result of that is that you may have someone at the top who says, I believe in this. In the case, one case of a major American network, it was because a very senior network executive himself had PTSD. He recognized that he had PTSD, but he was unable to communicate that down through the line management so that everyone understood that this is the way this issue is going to be dealt with at that network.
I'm glad you brought up the Australian Broadcasting Corporation because it actually has a corporate-wide peer support structure. So people in the newsrooms are trained to be peer support workers, and so their own colleagues can call on them, tap them on the shoulder, and actually talk about some of this stuff. Do you think that, to what extent do you think peer support might be a valuable asset in newsrooms?
I think it's really interesting in the Australian example. It is really peer support. So it's you're not your foreign editor and not your assignment editor, and it's not your executive producer calling you up and saying, "So how you doing?" It really is on a peer-to-peer basis. I think that that's important. However, I think the Australians have found it to be quite effective. And if you think about the things that Australia has been dealing with, terrible bushfires in particular, and a number of other disasters of one type or another, it has been very useful where people have found that just a simple outreach, hey, are you okay, has been useful. However, that does not work in cultures which are not collegial. And if you are in an organization which by definition does not have a collegial culture, and where you have an organization where the tone set for the top is basically dog eat dog, and I have worked in some of those organizations, then that won't work. Because why would you want to admit that you are struggling to someone who essentially is your mortal competitor and would really rather have had that assignment? Thanks so much.
Dr. Anthony Feinstein, who you spoke so highly of, has also done some groundbreaking research on something called moral injury. For those of you who don't know or haven't heard of that, that's when a person perpetuates, witnesses, or fails to prevent acts that transgress their own moral code or that of, and their ethical values. Given your experiences overseas, how might a journalist struggle with moral injury? Oh, man. I mean, where to start? I mean, you see a child who is in so much need, and what do? I mean, I'm there as a witness. I'm not an aid organization. I don't have the capacity to call up C-130s loaded with, with wheat. I don't have the capacity to change the course. I'm there to tell a story, to try to engage, to hope that by engaging, the hope that in telling that story, people will engage, and that might make a difference. But on a human level, on the most basic human level, like that 2-year-old child I talked about, what can I do with this child? What can I do? And was there ever a moment when you were in that situation where you did sort of feel compelled and you did something that in your mind crossed out of the journalistic line into, the line of your own humanity overwhelmed your, I guess, journalism impartiality? Yeah, there were times. There were times when I did things that probably my employers might or might not have approved of. Aniran, we're going to throw over to you. I have one more question for Sheila, but I'll hold it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Matthew, and thank you, Sheila, for bringing such an important issue to this lecture. I'm interested in, as you know better than most, generations of journalists have been trained on this idea of maintaining a very strict line between journalists and sources. Journalists don't get involved in stories. Journalists don't get involved with sources, and so forth. And I'm wondering whether your experience, especially in ways that pertain specifically to mental health, have caused you to rethink that idea about the relationship between journalists and sources, and in what ways, if so?
I think, as I spoke, the trauma piece of that is if you're dealing with people who are suffering and who are dealing with terrible events in their lives. And then there is really a responsibility. There is a duty of care in the same way in which I am arguing that employers have a duty of care towards their employees. There is a duty of care that you inflict no greater harm, that you don't do anything that is going to make this person's situation even worse. I think there's also been a kind of a bit of a shift. I, to a certain extent, attribute it to more women being in the field, where there is sometimes a greater focus on the impact that conflict or disaster has on life, on how life works, as opposed to the machinations of one military against another. And I think there is a bit of a change there.
Thank you.
The microphones are there if you've got questions. This is as I said at the beginning, a golden opportunity to hear from someone. And I think just for Sheila's benefit, maybe if folks introduce themselves in sort of their own context and why they're here. Thank you.
Sure. Hi, Sheila. Thanks.
Hi.
My name's Joseph Metzier. I'm a freelance writer, and thank you for speaking on that. I was curious to know who is the journalist who was doxxed the way you described, and if you're not comfortable saying, what was he reporting on?
I'm not comfortable saying, talking about who he was, or to who he is. He was reporting on an organization in the United States called FAIR, F-A-I-R, which has sometimes been associated with right-wing groups. And so his reporting was based around that. The police I know that the police have spoken to people who are at the leadership of FAIR, and they have denied all knowledge of, and so it's very difficult at this point. It's very difficult to know whether those who were doing the doxing are even in the United States or if they're somewhere else.
Thank you.
Sir, thank you.
My name is Barry Wilson. I was a journalist for many years and a graduate from Carleton Journalism 50 years ago, exactly 50 years ago. A question about journalism school itself. I think my experience is, both when I was in J school, but also since, that a lot of students arrive with great expectations, with a lot of mythology really about journalism and how important it is and how glamorous it is and so on. Do journalism schools do enough to prepare their students for the real world that you've described, which is a very complicated, sometimes quite brutal world that journalists have to live in? Are they properly prepared? Do they get the idealism worked out of them?
I think a little idealism is always a good thing. Otherwise, why would we keep doing this? I'm not. I have to tell you, I'm not familiar enough with the curriculum today that's taught here. My daughter, as I mentioned, is a fairly recent graduate from another school in another country, actually. And in terms of idealism, I think that there was a pretty clear understanding of the difficulty that there is in this particular media environment, and that there was, and that the kind of thing that you would be able to accomplish. I mean, this media environment is extremely tough, and you can spend, if you're a recent graduate, you can spend a lot of time, hanging around on the bottom rails, trying to get a foothold on the rung. And I think people are pretty clear-eyed about that, And I think that they are pretty cognizant of what that means. So in terms of the glamour of it all, I'm not so sure that this current generation thinks that it's very glamorous at all.
We'll go there and then we'll go to Joanne.
Hi. So my big question was, how do you minimize the kind of fight or flight response that you get from trauma triggers, such as, like you said, fireworks and gunshots?
As I said, I've had a fair amount of therapy, and I try to avoid it where I can. Sometimes I'm not successful, but I'm also at a distance. I'm at a distance both physically and in time, and that helps. There are other people who, PTSD is sort of a continuum, a spectrum, and there are other people who are farther along the spectrum than I am, who just have a much greater difficulty. There's new work being done now with LSD, with ecstasy, with some other drugs that have had whole other lives, that shows some promise in easing symptoms in those who are most traumatized. But those are things that are still in development and are still not fully tested out yet.
Joanne.
Hi, I'm Joanne. I'm a local reporter here. I cover City Hall, actually. Thank you for your talk. It was fascinating. I have a lot of questions, but I actually want to bring it back to something that Matthew talked about how many of us in this room, students and veteran journalists alike, we work on a local level. We're not experiencing the kind of trauma you talked about, but you did mention social media, right? This is something so new people are dealing with. And I'm wondering how both a journalism school deals with it as well as a veteran reporter. I remember a little while ago, someone in my newsroom was writing a story that was going to be controversial, and decided not to put her byline on the story. And that is her right. But because it was going to bring out a lot of trolls, right? And just did not want to face that. And I have to be honest, I don't know what I think about not putting your byline on something for that, right? I mean, when we report on things, we're in the middle of controversy sometimes, but we should not actually be having to be in the middle of trauma either. So how are we going to navigate this new field? What do you think about that? And how are we teaching journalists, young journalists, to do that? Because a lot of older journalists are not doing well. I mean, I know people who just have opted out of Twitter because they just can't take the hassle. I kind of get that, but there's a lot of news happening there too, right? So don't we have to be there? And I just was wondering if you thought about that, and Matthew as well, you too, about at the teaching level.
So one of the requirements in many newsrooms these days is that you do have a social media profile, and sometimes you will get a job based on how many followers you've got. So, and I agree, I mean, Twitter is a swamp. Yeah. There's no, and the trolls lurk everywhere. Some news organizations, if you have published something that is controversial or something that is particularly, is going to inflame opinion, literally there are people who will block you from seeing your mentions, seeing the responses to you, and that there will be other people within the news organization who will go through your Twitter feed and just make sure that there's not some guy with a gun going to be standing outside the office for you when you leave at 5 o'clock. And that is a real thing. And some news organizations are better at this than others. And I am of the view that if you're going to make people be on social media platforms like Twitter, where incivility does tend to be the name of the game, that you're going to have to figure out a way to protect your people. And if the answer is that, okay, you're publishing this story and we're just going to cut you off from your mentions and somebody else is going to go through them for you, maybe that's the answer.
I think that's actually, if I may, it's interesting you call Twitter a swamp. I still think that probably biologists could tell us there is some value to a swamp. I think of Twitter more as I think of it more as a sewer, a sewer that I have to swim in sometimes. But there's some interesting research, Joanne, done by Amnesty International on the abuse that women journalists and politicians in particular face on Twitter, and it's shocking. And there is also what Sheila's talking about is considered one of the best practices. If you have a colleague who is being targeted on social media, one of the simplest ways you can be an ally is to say, how about I check your email? How about I monitor your social media account? I'll flag all the emails. I'm not going to read them. I'm going to flag them so that you can deal with them, and I will get rid of the hate mail for you. Or, and I think it's also, you touched on the generational divide. It's really important for, I think, older journalists who maybe aren't digital natives, who maybe don't understand or use Twitter a lot, to not say, you know, what happens on social media isn't real life. Because for that person, it can very much feel like real life. And if they're being threatened, if it's their appearance that is being attacked, that is very hurtful. And I think it's also that if you reflect on how we spend our time on social media, you're often alone. You don't have your defenses around you. So maybe you're on the subway, maybe you're in the toilet, wherever you are on social media, it's like it can also be some of that like one-on-one. It's like the trolls and you, and it's like you're having a conversation with them, and they're winning because there's often more of them than you.
Yeah, and it seems, and no matter how you respond to them, it just further inflames things. It's just like putting a flamethrower on a situation.
And I think it's also really, I think news organizations have a responsibility to lay out for people what the social media responsibilities are. Are journalists supposed to be on social media 24/7? Is that a part of the job? Or, you know, at 6 o'clock on Friday, you're not expected to be watching your Twitter. That's harder, easier said than done, of course. We've got some questions here. I think we'll go here and then back over there.
Hi, my name's Sandy. In 1976, I was a first-year journalism student here, and you were my TA. And this is the first time I've seen you since then, other than on TV.
A great reunion.
So, yeah. So that's why I'm here. And I've never forgotten you telling us as your students about some of your experiences with Professor Scanlon on the crisis team when you went to Niagara during the terrible winter, and your encounter with a woman whose son had just been killed.
Yes.
And you and Professor Scanlon arrived before emergency services.
Yes.
And at that time that you told us that story, you know, I found it very shocking. And I sort of came away with the idea that, and I could be wrong, but that at that time, the sort of attitude at the school was, it was a reporter's job to get the story no matter what. And I know since like I say, I'm not sure, maybe I had the wrong takeaway from that. But you've had a very long and successful career since then, and I guess I'm curious to know, compared to the person you were then and now, what, if anything, is different for you in terms of what the journalist's responsibility is, or what the limits are when a journalist is faced with someone who's just experienced that type of trauma?
That's a really difficult question. You know, the journalists have always worked in newsrooms where when something terrible has happened to a family, some poor schmuck gets sent out the door to go knock on the door of the family home and ask for the photograph. And there, that's been a practice that's gone on for a very, very long time. And it feels intrusive, and it feels wrong, and it feels wrong in a human sense. And sometimes you find that that whoever answers the door just really does not want you there. And sometimes you find that they welcome human contact because they have a story to tell. And if they tell their story, then the memory of whoever it is that they've lost lingers a little longer. It's very difficult when you are talking to anyone or dealing with anyone or any community that is any kind of extremist, that is facing anything that is for them traumatic or catastrophic. It is extremely difficult to know how welcome you are and how best to approach what it is that you're there to do. It's difficult. It's difficult in the most human sense.
Thank you.
Hi there. I'm not a journalism student, but I am interested in going
But you're
into...
very welcome here.
Thank you. It's been great. I am interested in going into the field of humanitarian aid, so I thought it was fitting to come. Obviously, you faced quite a lot of hardship in your career and trauma as well. How did you motivate yourself to go back into the field despite it all? Aside from the fact that you may lose your job or risk your reputation, how did you personally motivate yourself not to give up and to back away?
You know, it's a really interesting question, and that's actually a question that Feinstein addresses in some of his research. So there is a subset of colleagues who thrive on it. That's just the most exciting thing going, and they're not alive unless they're there. I have a British colleague named Anthony Lloyd, who's a fantastic writer, brilliant writer, who wrote a book called My War Gone By, I Miss It So. And it was about the Balkans. It was also about not only his own addiction, as he described it, to war, but his own addiction to heroin, which was a side product of his addiction to war. And, I have another friend who is a brilliant cameraman for ITV, Independent Television News in the UK, who wrote a book called War Junkie. And the junkie part of it is really the telling word. So there's that group, and then there is another group, which is in Feinstein's reckoning, a slightly larger group, which is more motivated by the desire to bear witness, and the notion that if in bearing witness you may be able to make a difference, and feeling the obligation. Martha Gellhorn once said, "You can only love one war, the rest is all responsibility." And that's the point. It's sort of like, it's my job, that's what I do, I'm here to do this, and I'm here to bear witness and to, if I can, hold those responsible accountable. It's the notion that it's not that if I wasn't there, there wouldn't be somebody else who would go and do it. That's not what I'm saying. But it's the notion that I may be able to make a difference. It may be just the tiniest, tiniest difference, but maybe I can make a difference. And that's, I think, what the notion is that for me was the driver.
Joseph?
Hi, my name's, is this on?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, my name's Joseph Tunney. I'm a local journalist and also a master's student here, two worlds. But really, my question's a bit of a cliche, but I'm a young journalist, hopefully with a long career ahead of me. What's one actionable thing that you would tell your younger self that all the young journalists in the room could benefit from? Kind of one, again, actionable piece of advice.
If you think you need a lawyer, you do. I don't mean to make light of your question, but if there was one piece of advice that I wish somebody had given me, it would be that. If you think you need a lawyer, you do.
Hi, I'm Yasmin. I'm a journalism student here, and I'm wondering, you as a journalist that is a woman, what hardships have you faced that you think you wouldn't have faced being a man?
Well, you know, it's a funny thing, because sometimes in a lot of places that you would think would be more hostile to women, you get treated as an honorary man. So you get best of both worlds. So if for men, the woman's side of the household would be closed off. So what's happening to the woman and kids, the men can't necessarily find out, because that's part of a closed world to them. I can go talk to the men, and because I'm this foreign woman who's rocked up, they will talk to me. And then I can go to the other side of the house, and I can talk to the women and the children. So that is a benefit and a privilege. And it's very helpful, and one that I found helped me enormously. There are issues that confront women that don't necessarily rise to the same level for men. Sexual assault is one, it's obvious. And that can feel very difficult. It can feel that you can find yourself in situations which can very quickly feel more threatening than they might otherwise to your male colleagues. But on the whole, there was an enormous benefit.
Hi, my name is Kate. I'm a Master of Journalism student here. My question is, what's one thing that surprised you about yourself, or that you learned about yourself in reporting in conflict zones?
I suppose that I could do it. I mean, unlike somebody who chooses a career in the military or chooses a career in the police force or whatever, I had never really consciously sought out to become a correspondent who covered war. That just sort of happened, and I was along for the ride. So I guess the notion for me was that I actually could do it, and that I could do it with humanity, and that I could do it with some skill. I guess that would be. I was not necessarily be the first person you would think of if you knew me, who would go traipsing off someplace in a flak jacket.
Sheila, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned your daughter who is a journalist now, and I've talked to a lot of journalists before who tell me that there was a bit of a change in their life once they had children. And so I was going to ask you, was there a time in your career, particularly when you were assessing overseas assignments, that the presence of children in your life changed that balance or changed that equation for you?
I already had my daughter when I began my overseas career, in large measure. So when I went off and did all this stuff, I was always conscious that I had my daughter at home. And I have a friend who had her child. It seemed to sort of sail through sort of the Balkans and a bunch of Middle East stuff, and seemed to be doing quite well. And then she had her son, and everything suddenly became a risk. Everything, even the most living in a wonderful European capital, living in a safe and secure place, all of a sudden everything that she had done and kind of suppressed became very threatening and became very risky. And so her behavior shifted, changed. But for me, I mean, I had my daughter, and I was going off and doing this stuff, and I was always very cognizant of that. I often felt very guilty. A lot of journalists who participated in Feinstein's work talk about the disconnect between being in the field and doing the work, and then having to return to normalcy, the normal life, and talking about how suddenly normal life feels like it has a whole lot of sharp edges attached to it, and that you're navigating something that in some ways is much more complicated. And that's something that a lot of journalists who've covered conflict confront. Some people I know sort of self-isolate. They don't go, they finish an assignment and they don't go directly home. They go park themselves in a hotel for 2 or 3 days to just kind of get that worn off. Mm-hmm. And when you're in a place like the Balkans, it's a 2-hour flight. And it's, you go from one reality, which is hideous, to another reality, and trying to make that shift in your head in those 2 hours is virtually impossible.
You also mentioned some of the work that your daughter does. If there was a time that she came to you and said she wanted to go cover a foreign conflict, how would you feel about that, or what would you say to her?
What could I say? I mean, seriously, what could I say? Apple tree. What could I say? I mean,
would you be proud if she wanted to do that?
No, I'm proud of. She could be covering, the Great British Bake Off, and that would be fine with me. No, I mean, it really is a question of personal choice and personal desire. I know that she wants to go back to live in London sometime. That raises the possibility that she would be doing some of that work.
I think we have probably one more question, and we have a couple more. Okay. Christy?
Thank you very much for your lectures, Ben. My name is Zulf. I'm also a Carleton University alumni. Professor Kesterton was my professor too.
Yeah.
I wonder whether there are any others who would like to lift their hands and say they were Kestertons.
There's a whole crew over here.
Wow.
Yeah. With regards to Rwanda, you mentioned your experience with the little girl.
Yes.
I was wondering whether you found yourself in any situation where the Hutus running for their lives turned to you for help, and how that affected you. If ever there was a situation like that. Were you ever in that situation?
No, I never was. I mean, the only time I talked about the boys, the elementary school boys, the Tutsis.
Yes.
Okay. So these were very small boys. And they were there. Their parents had been murdered. Their baby sister had been murdered, and they were there largely on their own. And they were surviving by kind of scavenging off the international news crews that had set up these tent encampments. And we basically would, we'd feed these kids and give them some money, and we knew that they were desperate to stay out of the hands of the UN because the UN was opening up these big refugee camps and pushing everybody in together. We knew that they did not want to go into these camps. And I didn't know. I mean, these kids had very, very few resources. Their community was in a mess. They were in a mess. And I went back to Rwanda about 2 years later, and we checked into, there was a hotel that was then available. We got to the front desk of this hotel in Gisenyi, and I said to the front desk clerk, "Do you know a little boy named Afujwa?" And he said, "No, I don't know anybody that name." I thought, okay, he doesn't know, but who knows what happens to these children. Afujwa was a relatively unusual name. So the next morning, we are rolling out of the hotel, and I am sitting in the front seat of whatever the four-wheel drive was that we were in, and standing on the street corner is Afujwa and his two brothers. I was so excited to see them, I jumped out the window of the car. I didn't even open the door. I went out the window. And the cameraman later said to me, as we were shooting at the time, so I think that the reason why I didn't open the door is because the cameraman was on the floor. The cameraman later said to me, "The next time you're going to jump out the window, would you please let me know?" At any rate, Afujwa and his brothers had lost their parents, but they had found an aunt, and they were living with this aunt, and they were doing well. They were well, and I was so pleased to see them.
Thank you. Thank you for your work.
Thank you.
Christy?
Hi, thank you very much for doing this with us tonight. My name is Christy Kirkup. I'm a reporter at the Globe and Mail, and I also went to Carleton. I'm wondering, what responsibility do you think organizations hold in preparing interview subjects emotionally for the weight of a story when it's publicly released?
That is a great question. And it's a question that's more often, that is, I think, sort of more often dealt with in longer format documentary and sometimes programming sense. But in terms of, if you're thinking about Me Too, as an example, if you're thinking about the women who first began speaking up publicly about Harvey Weinstein or others, I do know that those reporters worked with their sources extensively to make sure that they understood the import of what would happen if and when their names became public, and if and when they made the decision that they were willing to have their names made public. And that takes time. That takes the creation of a relationship. The subject has to have trust in you. You have to have built that relationship. You have to trust that your management will trust your decisions and trust that relationship. I do think it is really important when there is a story, if you're talking about survivors of childhood sexual abuse as an example, talking Me Too, any of those stories where there is a sudden light that is going to be shone on an individual, I think that there is enormous responsibility to do what you can to prepare that individual, and then to protect them. I'll give you an example. As Matthew mentioned, I run a documentary company. And we are in preliminary discussions with someone who I cannot name about her life story. And part of the discussion has to be about how we are going to protect her the best we possibly can if she agrees to do this project with us. And it means everything from running interference on her, on media requests, on trying to protect, trying to ensure that she's prepared for what could be extremely difficult. And I really do believe that that's really important.
Thank you.
Last question goes to you.
Keep it quick. My name is Joel, and I'm a proud alumnus of Carleton's doctoral program in psychology. I just have one question. I hope it's not too personal, but I think you'll agree, and I don't like to be presumptuous, but the environments we work in and the people we work with, we learn a lot from those, and I believe in lifelong learning. Is there anything that perhaps one individual you worked with in any of the areas you reported from that they said to you that resonated with you, that sticks with you? As an example, I didn't give any more information because I've been working 22 years in the federal prisons, and now I won't say where I work as a clinical psychologist, but I find it an insidious process where we actually, through our learning, also take on some of the behaviors, and I have a degree of hypervigilance because of the individuals I work with now and over the 22 years. But once working out west in a federal prison, a young Native individual said, "You can't raise a Native kid to be Dutch." And that was related to the 60s scoop. And a lot of Indigenous people that I met that seemed strange. They had Scandinavian names, but they were living in British Columbia. So I was just curious if there's anything. I liked your quote, "If you think you need a lawyer, you do." That probably didn't come from someone maybe that was a subject of a story, but
No, that came from me.
Right. Well, I appreciate that because I've had to take advantage of lawyers as well. But any comments from anyone you've spoken with in your travels overseas that resonate with you in terms of life learning, or?
You know, by the end of the Balkans Wars, I was so fed up. I mean, we're talking the 20th century, and I was so fed up with hearing 14th century justifications for 20th century atrocities that I really had it. I mean, to hear. And I just was tired of hearing that same justification repeated over, nonsensical justification repeated over and over and over and over again. And I was doing an interview with some Serb warlord somewhere who launched off on the usual litany of 14th century complaints. And I lost it. I completely lost it with him. And I said, you know, I just never want to hear how, I just want to understand how you are using that justification for what you have, the atrocities you have committed in the 20th century against your own people, against your own neighbors. And the answer was kind of like, well, you know what, I could. And I sort of just never forgot.
Thank you.
That's okay.
That's okay.
Happens to all of us.
Exactly. Only in my case, I wouldn't be able to find my phone.
Thank you so much. Sheila, I just wanted to ask one last question, which is how you are doing today, and how, how do conversations like this go for you? Does it bring it all up for you and you'll have a difficult week, or what is your process for sort of taking care of yourself tonight and in the coming days?
Xanax. And I'm not really kidding. No, it's as I've said, I'm at time and distance. Time and distance are extremely useful. I've talked about things that I could not talk about for a very long time. It is a measure of how far I've come that I am able to talk about these things, and I'm willing to talk openly about this. And I'm willing to talk openly about this because I really sincerely believe that this is absolutely central to the health of, that not only mental health is important, but that it is central to the health of journalists and journalism going forward, that we have got to get a grip on this, and we've got to figure out a way to better support people. So yes, it's been difficult. It's been kind of an interesting process writing this and talking about this and putting things down on paper again. Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you, Sheila, for
Matthew.
the work you did, for paying the price that you have, and for having the courage tonight to come and talk to us about
Thank
it.
you, Matthew.
I want to thank Dean Andre Plourde and Susan Harada and their wonderful teams for organizing this event tonight. And of course, I want to thank all of you for being here. Of course, again, I want to just highlight that there are some resources available locally if you need support. I think the slide is probably up on the screen. And certainly take care of yourselves tonight and in the coming days. And finally, I hope you'll join us in the beautiful atrium for some treats and some snacks and hopefully some of those Costco brownies if I don't beat you to them. Thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you.